Everybody. My name is Mickey Trescott, and today I will be giving a presentation about the updated autoimmune protocol using core and modified AIP in clinical practice. So the autoimmune protocol should definitely be on your radar if you are a practicing nutrition professional. If you aren't aware, AIP is a science-based elimination and reintroduction dietary and lifestyle protocol. It focuses on repairing gut health, balancing hormones, and regulating the immune system. So the dietary side of what we call AIP includes removing food-driven sources of inflammation. This is done with an elimination diet, and restoring nutrient density. This is done with adding foods, specific foods to the diet. While the lifestyle component includes approaches to sleep, stress management, movement, and connection. And this is including both with other human beings and nature. And we do all of this to help best manage autoimmune disease. The autoimmune protocol has been used successfully alone or in combination with conventional treatments depending on a person's needs, and has also been the focus of medical research. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with AIP, especially if you caught my presentation last year on the research update of a lot of the intervention medical studies that have been done with AIP. But this is a really good soundbite to save and even commit to memory if you're used to discussing AIP with your clients, your patients, or even collaborative providers, because it's kind of hard to sum up in a nutshell. And this is the best that I've ever been able to do to just talk about, in essence, what are we talking about when we're talking about AIP? So in depth, the autoimmune protocol is a multi-phase process. So one of the biggest misconceptions is that it is a diet and a diet alone, and it is something that people do forever. AIP is not a diet. It is not a person who is going through the autoimmune protocol might look completely different in terms of implementation from another person, even if they have a similar autoimmune disease, or even if they're doing a similar version of the protocol. And that's just because it is something that somebody works through, and ideally with the help of a coach, which is why I hope a lot of you are listening in order to help your clients understand how to actually implement this in their own life. So the multi-phase process includes transition. So the elimination phase is dramatically different from the standard diet or even a healthy diet that a lot of people are eating. So there is a period of gradual transition, which is what I recommend these days. Transition can vary in length from, say, a long weekend to as long as 6 weeks. And sometimes in my own practice, I have even gone longer. I have had clients who maybe for the first month, they can just do gluten-free. And then the second month, they can add on dairy-free because the starting place is just so far and overwhelming to do an elimination diet. So I want you guys to really consider that transition is its own phase, and consider how you're going to ask someone to transition, because it is no longer acceptable, especially when our profession entails health coaching and nutrition consulting and the really high touch hand holding, helping people successfully implement these interventions. We should not be just giving them lists of foods and tell them, okay, do this. We should actually be thinking what is going to be the hard barrier that they're going to have to overcome, and work on that for a manner of weeks. So the second phase is called elimination. This is the one that we're most familiar with. If you have done any type of elimination diet work in your practice, you're very familiar that a person needs to be compliant, fully compliant in elimination diet for a certain amount of time. For the autoimmune protocol, we recommend at least 30 days, but we do allow for up to maybe 90 days in some cases. And that's when somebody is going to maintain. So the reason why we recommend staying so long in transition is so that people really have a long time to settle in and sustainably be able to manage that elimination phase, because it is really important that it is fully compliant because of the immunological part of how food sensitivity works. We really need them to make sure that they're keeping those foods out. So also during this period, there's an addition of certain nutrient-dense foods that are strongly encouraged. I like to teach that they are required, not every single one on the list, but a person really does need to make an effort to be including some of these extra nutrient-dense foods because they are a part of the protocol. Next, we have reintroduction, where the reintroduction is another period. It is not something that happens in a week or two. It's actually sometimes can last far longer than elimination, depending on a person's reaction and where they're coming from. But it happens after somebody has been in that elimination phase for 30 or 90 days. Maybe they're experiencing some success. Now, a misconception here is that we are looking for complete remission of symptoms or somebody that's completely healthy. That is really unrealistic, especially with people with autoimmune disease in 1 to 3 months. But what we are looking for is an improvement on baseline, because when you have an improvement that is measurable, hopefully they are tracking with journaling, then they can tell when they reintroduce foods one by one if there is a change in their symptoms and attribute that potentially to some of these foods or these lifestyle triggers. So once somebody has worked through reintroduction, they have this individualized, sustainable, and both practically, so what they can implement, and then socially. And it's a nutrient dense diet. And it should always be the least restrictive diet that gives them the best health. So for long-term maintenance, everybody ends up with something that is fully customized and perfect for them. And it takes into account their preferences, it takes into account their nutritional needs, it takes into account their sensitivities. And this is why AIP really should not be looked at as a diet. It should be looked at as a process for somebody to discover really, truly what works for them. So, how do we know that the autoimmune protocol is effective? Now, if you caught my presentation last year with my partner, Jamie Hartman, you'll remember that we did an entire presentation on the clinical efficacy of the autoimmune protocol as evidenced in the current medical research. And so, starting in 2015, Dr. Conagetti, who's referenced here in this slide, this is the very first study that was done on AIP. She contacted me because she had a patient with ulcerative colitis who had heard about AIP and was looking at a bowel resection and was curious if she would recommend that they try the autoimmune protocol for 30 days. And so she gave this patient the go ahead. And when they came back and repeated a colonoscopy, they had no lesions. They were in clinical remission. And she got really curious and was like, hey, can you tell me more about this protocol? Because she's head of the gastroenterology research division at Scripps in San Diego. Naturally, she was very curious and wanted to do some dietary research. And so she got in touch with me and Angie Alt, who was my partner and AIP certified coach at the time. And we consulted her on how to design a study on the autoimmune protocol based on what we were teaching in the program and using in our practices at that time. So that's kind of how the studies started. I'm not going to go through all of the studies, but we can learn a lot about the efficacy, the potential efficacy. Of course, these are pilot studies, so they are the very, very beginning of something being studied, but they do give us a lot of insight into how they might work for modifying autoimmune conditions. So here's a list of all of the medical research done on the autoimmune protocol to date. Things were really picked up around like the late 2010s, and then COVID happened. And so there's a couple studies still waiting in the data analysis and publish stage, which has taken a little bit of a long time because of the slowdown with all the labs and everything. But the first category that has really had the most study is inflammatory bowel disease. And this refers to both Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. These are separate autoimmune conditions that affect the digestive tract. They're often lumped together for research purposes because they have some pretty similar mechanisms. So the first study is the one that Dr. Conagetti and her team performed in 2015, was published in 2017. That's efficacy of the autoimmune protocol for inflammatory bowel disease. They took a small group of 16 patients that had Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. They walked them through a slow, gradual transition to AIP and then an elimination phase, fully compliant. And then they tested them along the way with different biomarkers. They did colonoscopies, they did stool samples and everything. And so out of that, they had the results of the pilot study, which is the first paper. The second was quality of life analysis, because of course we know that people with autoimmune conditions, even if their clinical symptoms and their condition is managed, they often have impacts on quality of life. So they did a separate analysis for that. And then the third is intestinal RNA expression. So they took tissue samples from 4 of the patients. I believe all the patients had ulcerative colitis, and they tested the RNA expression before and after, and then compared it to see if there were any changes that could be attributed to the diet. And then lastly, they also did a survey, which was asking patients with IBD who had used AIP. This is a completely different group than the intervention. And they just surveyed them and said, how long have you had this condition? How long did you use AIP? Was there any change in your medication? Have you been in clinical remission? And so on and so forth. So next we have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and in 2018, the Hashimoto's pilot study was run. It was modeled after the IBD study, so same 6-week transition. This time they had a 10-week elimination phase. And it was all extremely similar to the IBD study, except the patients this time had Hashimoto's, so they weren't taking colonoscopy as the results. They were doing thyroid hormone and inflammatory markers and some other interesting functional medicine testing. And then lastly, for AIP and rheumatoid arthritis, there has been an intervention study by a graduate of the AIP Certified Coach Practitioner Training Program, Julianne McNeil in New Zealand. And she will be publishing her data soon, but the abstract is currently published showing some good efficacy for rheumatoid arthritis. So here's a quick summary of the results. So in the pilot study with IBD, 73% of patients reached clinical remission at week 6. Everyone who reached clinical remission maintained throughout the duration of the intervention, so that was 11 weeks. And they saw trends for discontinued medication. So the patients they brought into the study, these were people who had failed conventional treatment. Many of them were on steroids and biologics, which are normal medications for IBD. So that was a great result. The quality of life, they saw a improvement in health-related quality of life. That's pretty obvious when you think of the symptom improvement and the clinical remission, but that is really important data there too. And then the RNA expression study was really interesting. Of course, I want to caution you guys, this is experimental research. There are not a lot of dietary RNA expression studies before and after dietary interventions. This is one of the first of its kind. But they showed that the genes associated with inflammatory T cell responses that led to autoimmune inflammation were downregulated, and then those that were associated with Treg cell responses that are attributed to mucosal healing and DNA repair were actually upregulated. So that points to possibly a mechanism by how a diet could help in this way. And then lastly, the IBD survey found the exact same number of clinical remission, which that's not a typo, 73%. This is a different group of people who had self-reported using AIP in autoimmune patient community. 32% of them reported discontinuing steroids because of AIP. So that was interesting to take in conjunction with the other research. Next, the AIP and Hashimoto's thyroiditis pilot study, the clinical symptom burden decreased from 92 at baseline to 29 after the intervention. 6 out of the 13 that were on thyroid hormone replacement either decreased their dosage or discontinued. HSCRP, which is an inflammatory biomarker, decreased by 29%. All of these are great results, but the one that really stands out to me as someone who works a lot with Hashimoto's is just that clinical symptom burden, because people with autoimmune thyroid disease often have lots of symptoms even when their thyroid hormone levels are optimized. So that is a really fascinating result for me. And then lastly, AIP and rheumatoid arthritis. I mentioned Julianne McNeil in New Zealand. She has done both qualitative research, which was a series of interviews, where she interviewed people to see basically how they got interested in AIP, what the hardest things were, if they thought it was worth it. And then she also did a pilot study where pain score, specifically symptom scale and pain scores, were the things that were captured in this, what they call RAPID-3, which is a scale. And it showed a reduction in pain from baseline to the end of week 12, and then specifically pain, fatigue, and sleep also were improved. All right, so what are some potential mechanisms for how the autoimmune protocol could work? So first, the researchers have proposed a few different things that they think might be going on here. So first, increased nutrient density is achieved both by eliminating nutrient poor foods and increasing intake of nutrient dense foods. Increasing support and community through access to health coaching team and peer group of study participants. Something that I haven't really mentioned yet is that all of the intervention studies here, the participants had access to high touch health coaching. They were not just given a list of foods, told to do a diet. They were communicating with each other. They were communicating with health coaches that included more behavioral health coaches, and then also registered dietitians, so that they could have their their needs met, and basically any barriers troubleshooted with a team. They also noticed that it could be decreased immune reactivity to foods. So, through excluding foods that somebody is allergic or sensitive to, a decrease in inflammation, which was seen in some of the biomarkers, specifically the Hashimoto study. And then also attention to lifestyle factors that are known to support healing. So things like sleep, movement, and stress management are all incorporated in the autoimmune protocol. We'll talk about this a little later, but it's not just a dietary protocol. So the effects of AIP appear to be synergistic and compounding, meaning that the various facets of the protocol work together to produce a greater effect than if they were applied alone. And what's really interesting and I think amazing is that we've had the opportunity to study all of these things together. I know a lot of the true scientists say, well, we actually want to take that one variable and we want to know, is it 5% change that we get from that, or 8% change that we get from that? But what I will say is that it is just really cool for patients that have specific autoimmune conditions to know, actually, this has a pretty good chance of moving the needle for me if I pay attention to all these different areas. And of course, we love looking at studies on sleep. We love looking at studies on stress management and seeing the specific interventions and what mileage we might get for that. But it is just, I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to be involved in this research and see basically, what so many people have experienced doing this on their own and sharing their stories now has been shown in kind of this very beginning of AIP research. All right. So this leads me to why the autoimmune protocol was updated in 2024. So the AIP has roots around 2012, maybe a few years prior. There's no one person that is credited with the beginning of AIP, and I could do a whole lecture on the history and the different people involved. But really, it started as a theoretical basis of which foods should be included or excluded based on medical research on the individual foods or the dietary components. And sometimes this involved humans and autoimmune disease, but often it involved animal models. And to be honest, it was the best that we had at the time. And the people that came up with the original threads that became AIP were very forward in their thinking and putting it together, because honestly, they put together something that truly worked. As word about this anecdotal efficacy spread, many providers started recommending and working with the protocol in their practices. I started practicing in 2013, and I created AIP Certified Coach in 2017, even when Angie and I started to teach the very first class, there were providers in that class who had been using AIP based on their own research and implementing what they felt intuitively to be right for years. And so that was really amazing to see it come together, and so many people really want to be using this in practice. Now that there's an emerging body of research into the efficacy of AIP, which started around 2017, as well as this large group of practitioners who have a lot of collective years in AIP implementation, it was time for analysis to see what's working and what could be made better for the next wave of individuals looking to embark on the protocol. So basically, in a nutshell, AIP was conceived of on a theoretical basis, and then a bunch of patients experimented on themselves, a bunch of practitioners started using it. And then, in the last couple of years, we kind of went, hey, now we actually have studies where we've looked at this in humans. We have lots of practitioners who've been using this with their clients. Let's do a little reset and see if we could change anything. What would we change? So on the next few slides, I have some of the biggest observations that we had that led us, and when I say us, it's myself and Jamie Hartman and I as leaders of the AIP certified coach community, because we did not make this change on our own. I'll talk about it in a little bit, but we did pull the whole community and the researchers, and it feels like a very collaborative decision. But these are really the things that we made us consider making a change. So the first thing is that many patients in the AIP medical study saw results before reaching a full elimination. And this was actually the biggest and first clue. So in that AIP pilot study on IBD in 2017, the 73% of patients that achieved clinical remission did that at week 5. So I will remind you that week 5 was before the 6-week transition phase was over. All of those participants that reached clinical remission maintained it through the elimination diet, and nobody who hadn't reached clinical remission at that point joined the clinical remission group. So that means that there was something about those early eliminations, which we created those stages based on experience in our practices and experiences in anecdotally in the community. This was not based on research. This was based on best practices, but it does tell us that we're onto something, because those earliest eliminations were likely responsible for the favorable results, and the ones at the end probably weren't, given that all those participants had reached clinical remission and that they stayed easily in remission for the duration of the study, and that nobody moved back and forth between categories. So this was the first clue. Second, the AIP certified coaches had reported good results without a full elimination. Now, something that is important to know is that as a part of the AIP certified coach practitioner training program, we have always taught heavy modification of the protocol. So the way that a lot of clients and patients learn about AIP on their own in the internet is just through websites. There are various resources that are credible, some are not credible, some of them have inaccurate data. But the way that we have taught is very modifiable and customizable and flexible, I will say. And using AIP as a practitioner has now become a thing starting, around probably 2015, 2017, when we created this program. Of course, we were not the first providers to be using AIP, but a lot of providers who were very motivated to work with AIP found us and took our program and have become a part of our community. And after training nearly 1,000 people from all different types of backgrounds and specialties, we have that really cool knowledge base of everyone's experience, everyone's collective experience. So when we set about this, we surveyed the graduate community. We were told by the alumni that they often found the original protocol more restrictive than necessary. Coaches were modifying a lot more than we had assumed. And they also reported that they were seeing really good results despite using a modified or less restricted autoimmune protocol. So third, other elimination diet research indicates that stricter is not always better. When AIP was originally conceived, there was very little research into the efficacy of elimination diets to help manage autoimmune disease. And I'm not just talking about AIP, I'm talking about any autoimmune disease, especially studies in humans. And in the last decade, that has completely changed. So many studies have been published using different elimination protocols for very specific autoimmune conditions, especially Hashimoto's, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, IBD, and using approaches that we would think as functional holistic nutritionists, very basic like gluten-free and dairy-free diets. And a lot of these studies show really good results for minimal interventions. And what that tells us is that for some patients and conditions, progress can be made with a simpler approach, which if you go back to the beginning, I said that the goal is the least restricted diet that produces the most health. So that should be setting off a little clue there. All right, number 4. Increasing accessibility, affordability, and sustainability can widen the reach of the autoimmune protocol. So a couple major barriers in the community of people who suffer from autoimmune disease and want to embark on this are food access and budget. Whether or not somebody is working on their own or working with a coach, some people don't have the ability to source or afford ingredients that they need to implement a full elimination, and some people just don't have the time to prepare all of their meals from scratch. So in this case, in the coaching program, we've always taught how to modify the protocol to accommodate these barriers, but providing an official version of the protocol that is more budget friendly and accessible will allow even more people to find healing through AIP. Okay, so what did this process look like? Basically, Jamie and I decided to take a few months and consult everybody. We talked to everyone. We had so many meetings where we were just picking everyone's brains. We interviewed the researchers who performed the AIP medical studies, which at this point, it has been almost 10 years, and just asked them, what do they think about the autoimmune protocol? What do they think about the foods eliminated? How have they been using the autoimmune protocol in their clinical practice since? We also talked about researchers in other areas that research in functional medicine and elimination diets. We talked to experts and writers in the area of autoimmune health. We surveyed and interviewed members of the AIP certified coach community, which I talked about before. Many of these providers focus exclusively on autoimmune conditions and have a knowledge base of hundreds and sometimes even thousands of cases and clients using AIP. And then lastly, we considered recent scientific evidence for elimination diets, food allergies and sensitivities, and reintroduction protocols. So like I said, there's so much research out there that is not specifically on AIP, but from which we can learn. And what Jamie and I learned from this explanation was twofold. So first, the original protocol really has a lot of value and efficacy in research and practice. All the researchers were like, wait a minute, don't change AIP. We're so interested in it. It showed really promising results, and we really want to keep studying it again. Our practitioner community said, hey, there is a whole subset of patients and clients that are really well served from this strict protocol, and we still use it. And then second, a lot of the researchers and AIP certified coaches were confident some patients would be best served by a less restricted option. So they kind of wanted both. And so we came out of this thinking we can preserve the original protocol and also introduce a new one, which could actually be a really interesting research opportunity to do a comparison studies and start to see the difference in efficacy between something like core and modified, and also for the coaches to give them something easier for an easier starting place for people who maybe it isn't appropriate for them to try core AIP. So now going forward, there are 2 versions of the elimination phase to be known as core elimination and modified elimination. So the original protocol as used in the medical studies and AIP literature isn't changing and is just now known as AIP core elimination. And like I said, that intention is to preserve the original protocol for research comparison and use with patients or clients who need a stricter approach or who really don't face a lot of barriers to implementing that easily. The new protocol, which is a less strict and more accessible version, is known as AIP modified elimination. And this new protocol incorporates what we've learned about foods that are well tolerated in the autoimmune community and is simplified for use of implementation, budget, and accessibility. So the next few slides, I have some lists of foods to include and avoid. And I will say, if this is overwhelming to you, there's a lot of different foods on these lists and they were hard to organize on slides. They are all available for free on my website, autoimmunewellness.com. As a practitioner or as a client, you can always go there and download the most recent protocol information, and it's always going to be updated and accurate. So I just want to mention that so that you don't have to feel like you need to capture all of this information from these slides, because there's a lot of food lists here. So on core AIP, the foods to include is similar to the foods to include before. It's including all vegetables, leafy, non-starchy, alliums, roots, tubers, fruits, berries, melons, citrus, tropical fruits, edible fungi and mushrooms, meat, poultry, fish, shellfish, sea vegetables, animal fats, offal, plant fats, probiotic foods. We'll talk a little bit about nutrient-dense foods in a bit, leaf, flower, root, and bark spices, specific beverages that are listed here, specific flavorings that are listed here, and sweeteners. Now, with modified AIP, the things that are added, I have highlighted here in yellow. They're going to be rice, pseudograins, and grain-like substances, legumes, except peanuts and soy, and then dairy, only ghee, and seeds, including oils and spices derived from them. So you can see this isn't a lot of difference, but these foods that are included, I'll go back, rice, but no other grains, legumes, which, that really those are really gonna expand protein sources for people who can't afford a lot of meat. And then dairy, ghee is another cooking fat, and then seeds have a lot of nutrient density to offer. And if we want to look at it from the elimination side, this slide has the core AIP elimination. So grains, dairy, pseudograins, legumes, nuts, seeds, nightshades, eggs, alcohol, and processed food additives. And then on this next slide for modified AIP, you can see grayed out the core AIP foods that are eliminated. So rice, ghee, pseudograins, legumes, accepting soy and peanuts and seeds, however you want to look at it. I'll go back and forth one more time just so you can see. There's just a little bit easier of a starting point with modified AIP. Okay. So this is your reminder to not forget about nutrient-dense foods. Now, like I said at the beginning, it's really easy to only think about the eliminations when we think of AIP. Eliminations are just a really small part of the protocol, and every single AIP study that has been done has implemented the addition of nutrient-dense foods. So what are nutrient-dense foods? The nutrient density of a food refers to the quantity of micronutrients relative to the energy it provides. So the way that your client implements nutrient density is individual and might have a role in the duration and depth of their healing process, especially if they are transitioning from a nutrient deficient diet. So while we're not talking about the really in-depth ins and outs of AIP here today, I really wanted to add a reminder for you guys to go back to those foods to include lists and think about the most nutrient dense foods and make sure that you are encouraging your clients with AIP to include them. The other reminder is to not forget about the other aspects of AIP. So AIP doesn't only consist of dietary changes, but it also incorporates lifestyle changes as well. The 4 areas that should be considered include sleep, stress management, movement, and connection. So all of this together is a powerful combination, and it's the reason why in the AIP medical studies, there was attention with the health coaching team to all of these areas. So the patients were not just given food lists and told to do this diet. They had coaches, they had peer support, and they were all trying to try little interventions, nothing overwhelming, but they were asked to, for instance, set a bedtime, do 5-minute meditations every day, make sure to get out for a walk or do some stretching, ask a friend or a family member for some support on their journey. And all of those things were a part of the positive results they saw. And so you definitely need to be considering them when you have clients who are implementing AIP, especially clients who might have in one of these areas that is really underdeveloped or have some serious issues. So for instance, the person who is only sleeping 4 hours a night, it might not actually be appropriate for them to start an elimination diet if they're experiencing insomnia or having some sort of barrier to sleep. So as a good coach, you should definitely troubleshoot that and consider that that could be impacting their progress. Okay, so after transitioning to the elimination phase and maintaining that for the proper amount of time, and I'll put in here 30 to 90 days, but that is pretty variable. The only thing I really want you to know is that AIP, the elimination phase, is not forever for anyone. So after somebody has moved through the elimination phase, they move on to the reintroduction phase, where each previously eliminated food is reintroduced to test for a response. So after carefully navigating this reintroduction phase where they go one at a time, they reintroduce all these foods, they are able to determine a customized dietary approach that best supports their long-term health. Foods eliminated during the elimination phase have been grouped into stages to streamline this reintroduction process. This is based on our clinical experience, anecdotal history. There have not been many medical studies on reintroductions, although, they are coming. And it is ideal to attempt reintroductions of foods that are most nutrient dense and least likely to cause a reaction first, and then wait to attempt reintroductions of foods that are least nutrient dense and most likely to cause a reaction last. For instance, if you have someone, who has rheumatoid arthritis, and right away they go, oh my gosh, I stopped eating bread, I think I'm allergic to gluten or sensitive to gluten, and they feel so great, and then they do the elimination diet, and then they start missing croissants, and then when it comes time to reintroductions, they're like, the first thing I want to reintroduce is gluten. You're going to be like, hey, wait a minute, don't start there. Like at some point, it's controversial whether or not anyone with autoimmune disease should try and reintroduce gluten. And, that's not what this presentation is about. But I will tell you, you will have clients who want to do it. There's a reason why that is at the very bottom of stage 4, if not advisable for anyone. And that's just because that is potentially going to cause a really big inflammatory reaction that is going to make someone feel very sad and potentially need a long time to recover from before they can then get to the place where they're reintroducing foods again. So we really want easy wins. We want the things at the top of the list to be least likely to cause a problem so that they feel like they're having this expansive effect on increasing foods in their diet. And because there are now 2 options for the elimination phase, so we have core AIP and modified AIP, there are different starting places for the reintroduction phase. So this slide details the modified AIP reintroduction stages. And if you've been familiar with AIP, you know that core AIP has 4. Because modified AIP only has less eliminations, there are less reintroduction stages because the starting place is in a different, basically further down the spectrum of diet. So stage 1, we have egg yolks, but not the whites, nuts, dairy, and nightshades, but only paprika and potatoes. Again, this is not based on any clinical research. This is based on our experience and anecdotal evidence. So take it with a grain of salt when you're working with your clients or your patients. Just know that you can adjust this as needed. It's what we have realized in guiding hundreds of people through this process. Is that those are the nightshades that people tend to tolerate the soonest. And then stage 2, egg whites or whole eggs, gluten-free cereal grains, nightshades or spices derived from them, and small quantities of alcohol. You'll notice the note that grains might be more well tolerated when soaked and fermented. Some people, some clients have the time and the resources to try that, some don't. So just keep that in mind. But yeah, because modified AIP has less eliminations, there are less reintroductions. So this list seems much more manageable and easier to work through. Core AIP, on the other hand, is the more restricted protocol. And because more foods are removed, we have broken things down into 4 stages. And these stages are the same as they have always been. So like I said, core AIP has not changed. The reintroduction stages have not changed. But you'll notice that because there are 4 stages, that each category of food might have some different foods in each stages. For instance, dairy, in stage 1, it's just ghee. In stage 2, it's butter and butter oil. In stage 3, it's buttermilk and some other dairy. And the reason why we do that is because the difference between, a tablespoon of ghee to saute some vegetables and drinking a glass of milk to someone who is sensitive to dairy is very different, right? So we've kind of separated things based on what we know of reintroductions and working with our clients. And as a coach, you can always modify and adjust things, but this is our suggestion for best practices in reintroduction stages. And then along with the 2024 update of the autoimmune protocol, where we announced modified AIP, the other thing we updated was the reintroduction procedure. And the previous AIP reintroduction procedure was based more on food allergy research, which now there's a lot more food sensitivity research. And so this procedure is just a little bit more straightforward. It has a little bit bigger quantities of food, which I think is a little bit more realistic for people, and it's more streamlined. So I recommend using this procedure to walk your clients through the reintroduction procedure. All right. To end the presentation, I'm going to address some common questions about core and modified AIP. So the biggest question is, do you start with core or modified AIP, right? Which one? So this is really going to depend on your client. I've said it twice before, I think, in this presentation, and I'm going to say it again, but the goal of AIP is always to discover the least restrictive dietary approach that produces the best health for your client. With this in mind, modified AIP is the perfect starting point for most people because it's affordable, it's accessible, it's easier to implement, and it still removes the most potentially problematic foods. So in a perfect world, modified AIP produces the desired result for your client, and then they can move on to that reintroduction phase, which, having just looked at those reintroduction stages charts, you can see it's much easier because there's less foods. It's going to take them less time. And it really, the overall effect is sparing them a drawn out elimination and reintroduction process, which is amazing. So why would you choose core AIP given that? Your client might have a condition like IBD where they're very motivated, or research indicates that the elimination phase has a good chance of producing results quickly. So specifically with IBD, that pilot study had people who had an average disease duration of 19 years. They had failed on conventional treatment. They were all in active flares despite using very expensive, very powerful biologic drugs. And in 5 weeks, 73% of them were in clinical remission. So for people with IBD, honestly, I still recommend core AIP, especially when they're in an active flare, because that is going to be a pretty good chance of getting that under control very quickly. And with a condition like IBD, there's bleeding, there's weight loss. There are consequences for not getting that under control very quickly. And so people are usually pretty motivated to make that happen. They could have another condition that is potentially serious and makes them very motivated to transition and implement to find relief. And especially if they don't experience barriers that make core AIP difficult. So these are people who maybe they are really good cooks, maybe they have a lot of financial flexibility. Some even have the ability to hire someone to come in and cook or buy prepared AIP food. Maybe they have a really supportive partner at home. All of these things I would say are unusual when we're looking at, the population of general. Most people do not have as much money as they need to, buy their groceries. Most people don't have enough time to cook, but there are people out there who are both motivated and can make it happen. And these are a good fit for core AIP. So what if you need to further customize modified AIP? So one of the things that I've really enjoyed teaching the practitioner community is that everything is customizable. And even with modified AIP, we've just provided an alternate starting point. But that's all it is a starting point. So your clients are all going to be unique individuals, and they might have things like additional food sensitivities, especially to included foods. So, like a coconut sensitivity is extremely common. I would say of all the foods that are included in the autoimmune protocol, that is probably the most common sensitivity. Is it common enough to mean that it shouldn't be an AIP? We've decided no, but in that case, you're just going to have them also remove foods they're sensitive to, foods that they don't like, foods that they don't feel well when they eat, even if they're included. They also might have other dietary needs or specific conditions. If this is something that you're qualified to work with in your scope, this also might influence your recommendations, and you can further customize there. So this has been a huge question. What happens to all of the recipes and resources labeled AIP? So you guys are probably familiar with the dozens of blogs and books, meal plans, and all of that now is just for core AIP. So what are we going to do, right? So I would encourage you to think of core AIP is just, or modified AIP as able to use all of those resources with an addition of beans and rice. So when you think of making a salad like this tuna salad, this AIP tuna salad I have a picture of here, your client could sprinkle some pumpkin seeds on it. Or if they're making an AIP chili, they could do like a nightshade-free AIP chili, which I have some free recipes on my blog. They could make a side of beans or rice to add to that if they're doing modified AIP. So those core AIP recipes and resources are so valuable and so helpful, but they can basically just be stretched by adding those modified AIP foods, because we know that the core and AIP included foods are extremely nutrient dense, and there are so many great recipes for them. Just know that if your client is doing modified AIP, you really want to educate them on the differences so that they don't get hung up. But that's true for anyone who's doing AIP because resources vary. I would encourage you guys to bookmark the definitive guide on the Autoimmune Wellness website. There's a link here on the slide. You can also Google AIP definitive guide and it will come right up. That has all of the most current protocol information and food lists. Your clients can download all of the food lists and meal plans. There's a lot of resources there, and that will always be updated. Should AIP change again, that will be added on the website. All right, so we're at the key takeaways. So first, the autoimmune protocol is an evidence-based framework to help a client with autoimmune disease or chronic illness discover the way of eating that helps best support their recovery. I hope that the short overview of research helped show you that the AIP is and has been studied, and I hope that you are encouraged and you can share that with your clients to show them that what you're recommending is actually rooted in evidence and is changing as new research comes out. Second, core AIP is the original version of the elimination protocol that was used in the medical research, and it is appropriate for the sickest or most motivated clients. So there is still use in that. Modified AIP is an alternate version of the elimination protocol that includes more foods and is more accessible for those who face barriers to implementation, just need an easier starting point. Since modified AIP includes additional foods, there is a new modified AIP reintroduction stage chart, and the reintroduction for both core and modified AIP is the exact same and has been simplified based on the most current research. So now you are up to date on all of those details. Here's a list of the references I use for this lecture. And if you guys are interested in AIP medical research, all of these papers are open access. If you just type the titles or the authors in Google, they will pop right up. I highly recommend reading them for learning more about AIP and how it was implemented in these studies. And I want to give a specific shout out for their reading for the Hashimoto study, which is the very first one on this list, because Dr. Abbott wrote up a case study of every participant, the 16 participants in the study. He did a lot of functional medicine testing, and he called out some of the individual results, which can be really helpful for learning more about what it might look like working one-on-one with someone and using AIP. Okay, and lastly, if you are interested in learning more about AIP and becoming an AIP certified coach, I'm running another version of the program coming up in September 2024. The program is run twice a year, spring and fall. We have more information at AIPcertified.com. We've got an interest list. So if you want some more information, you can just put your email there and we'll send you that. You can even sign up for a time to chat with me and discuss if it might be right for you. We've got early enrollment. And then if you're not working with clients with autoimmune disease and you want someone to refer, we have the directory on the AIP Certified Coach website as well. We also have functional medicine, doctors, naturopaths, and all different types of providers in the directory. So even if you do work with autoimmune disease and you want to network with a provider that in your area that also knows how to use AIP, that directory can be a great resource for you. So thank you so much for listening to this presentation. I hope you learned a ton about the new modified AIP. Good luck with implementation, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.